Insurance isn't one size fits all. That's why customers have enjoyed Progressive's Name Your Price tool for years now. With the Name Your Price tool, you tell them what you want to pay, and they'll show you options that fit your budget. So whether you're picking out your first policy or just looking for something that works better for you and your family, they make it easy to see your options. Visit Progressive.com. Find a rate that works for you with the Name Your Price tool. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
In 2025, a man called 911 to report he found his mother dead. But with a changing story and questions about his mental state, the victim's daughter is left alone to pick up the pieces. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. Just a little preface to this case. Years ago, I had a podcast called Impact Statement. I would let people come on to tell their stories and give their victim impact statements for everything from unsolved cases to domestic violence to what it was like growing up after the murder of a sibling. The point was to let people tell their stories and give their impact statements, even if they never got to court, and especially if they never got that moment. So when Jessica reached out to me to talk about her story of her mother's murder, I knew the only way to really do this would be to bring back the impact statement format for this episode. So I am going to still cover the true crime side of things like I usually do, but I will let Jessica tell you herself, her point of view on what happened around it. You will also hear from Dr. Paige Wilcoxson, a forensic psychologist who previously worked within the criminal justice system. She is not currently working in the field, and she has not interviewed anyone related to this case, but she did have some broad insights into the issues that came up that are based on her education and experience. So this case starts for the public in January of 2025. But for Jessica, it started far before that with her mother, Leda Files.
My mom was always like a pretty nurturing person. She was just overall, she had a very happy personality, very empathetic, smiling, laughing, trying to do things for others when she was able. And she loved animals. That was always like one thing she instilled in us. That was just like, you love animals, you take care of animals. She had her struggles, don't get me wrong. There were times where, I think her stability was sort of all over the place, I guess would be probably the best way to put it. But I think it's because she had gone through a lot of struggles and just trying to stabilize through her own traumatic events was difficult. But when we were little, I was always very close to her. She was always very loving and nurturing and, very, very affectionate. And I feel like she really genuinely wanted to show up.
When Jessica was a year and a half, Leda had a son named Sean Preston Lowe. Because of how close they were in age, Jessica and Sean were always close, but there were some issues between Sean's dad and Leda after they split up, and that led to custody changes that then put a strain on Sean and Leda's mother-son relationship.
I would say at times she struggled to be a strong parent. Particularly, I would say pertaining to my brother's behavior. I don't know that she always knew how to navigate that. And that was something that kind of came to play. She lost custody of him when he was, I think, 5. So he primarily lived with his dad. But then, he would come to our house on the weekends or maybe during certain times of, breaks or for longer stretches and things. And, quite frankly, I think it broke her heart. And she didn't know how to cope with that. And there was a lot of strain on their relationship because of that. She couldn't step back in and, take over this role as his full-time mom. And because I'll be really, really blunt, his dad really, really made sure that he knew, I guess, sort of the opinion that he had of my mom, which was never anything positive. There was nothing good to say. I feel like she could, cured cancer, and there would be something wrong. And that was something that was instilled in him at a very young age. The programming was there. It was, let's go ahead and just completely slain her character so that it's almost like just to prevent the relationship from probably being what it could have. So that was tricky.
Another thing that marked Sean's childhood were early behavioral issues that were noted by both friends and family. I asked Jessica about this because I think we need to get more of an idea of what we're talking about. The phrase behavioral issues is really a broad spectrum.
Sean, as a child, was the kind of kid that, needed attention on him at all times. It was, look at me, look at me, look at me. Very, hyperactive at times, but he could also be very sweet and kind and empathetic and, just your normal sweet boy. Don't get me wrong. But there was a lot of this. It was like, I like to refer to as pick me behavior that was going on. I do vaguely remember a few incidents that happened. I know that my mom's friend that we were really close with, she mentioned that she knew from a young age that he was not right. He was very angry, just very angry. And my stepdad, who we met when I was 5, so my brother was around 4, he may have even been 3. My dad has said the same thing, that there was just this anger. And once he was activated, you weren't getting him back down to earth. It was near impossible. He even said, at times, like using like a wrestling move to get him in sort of a restraint to where he could try to get him to calm down. That didn't help. And I remember some instances where just some odd behaviors occurred, I think, with animals. I remember he was like, when we were little, this particular incident, him getting in trouble for I think he was like cutting salamanders in half or something, or like cutting their tails off. And I just remember my mom came unglued. She was like, no, we don't do that. That's just inhumane, even though it's just a small animal. It's disgusting. And I know some of the cousins in the family on his side had expressed some stories that kind of happened, particularly his one cousin, like he held her underwater in the river, and just some bizarre instances that probably should have never happened.
Jessica and Sean initially grew up in the Pacific Northwest, but eventually Sean moved with his father and stepmother to Kentucky. So during his teen years, Jessica wasn't around him as frequently, but it is her understanding that he found a period of stability.
I wasn't around him because he did move to Kentucky, but actually I think his teenage years were the more stable years that he had. And I wonder if it's in part because of his stepmom being the one that was primarily around him. His dad was a long-haul trucker, so he wasn't with him all the time. And I think she did a great job of making sure he had things to keep him busy, whether it was, maybe events at school. He really was into fishing. He had a lot of support in that area. And I think that it was really helpful for him, and his behavior sort of like shifted into this, getting a little award at school or things like that. Like working hard. He had that kind of shift, and it was like, oh, this is really good, And I was happy for him because I wanted him to be happy. Even though we lived apart, it was hard, but he was different.
Finding ways for Sean to get positive attention clearly helped him out, and after high school, he immediately joined the Navy. But it was less than 2 years in that Sean was discharged. Everyone was surprised, and he had some answers as to why, but Jessica saw his paperwork. He was discharged due to drug use. So we have someone who struggled with behavioral issues in his younger years, was using substances, and then at 24, Sean was diagnosed with a benign brain tumor. And benign in this instance did not mean not harmful. It just meant not cancerous. So it wasn't going to spread, and the growth was slow, but it was pressing on important brain tissue, and Sean was experiencing symptoms. So he did have to have the tumor removed, and even after removal, he suffered from seizures that were certainly not helped by his continued drug use. Sean's adult life was not always easy, even outside of the health-related issues. He had arrests over the years, including for violence, like in 2016 when he assaulted 2 police officers, and then in 2020 when he was again arrested for assault. Those 2020 charges were dropped, but during all of this, he also split up with his longtime partner and the mother of his only child. Then he lost access to his daughter entirely. Jessica said the family wasn't always sure what was going on with Sean because he was not a reliable narrator. He would often have a story that didn't match with the official version of events. So even though people wanted to help him, it was hard to know exactly how because it was hard to know what was going on. Leading up to early 2025, Sean was living what Jessica described as a transient life, bouncing between a few Western states. In 2024, he was arrested on a drug possession charge in Wyoming, and in the summer of that year, he missed his court date for that charge, which then added a failure to appear on top of it. Sean, without many options in front of him, got on a train in December of 2024, heading back to his father's house in Oregon. But his dad thought maybe he should try something else. Here is Jessica again talking about what was going on in the family at this point.
So he was spending time in Wyoming and Colorado, and then it was, I believe it was like right before Christmas time. He had reached out to his dad and said that he was on a train and he was coming back to Oregon. At that point, he stayed with his dad a couple of nights, but his dad said, you probably shouldn't stay here. This is where you started using drugs to begin with, and this was in Oregon. And he decided to take the train up to my mom's. And at that time, her and I were obviously in close communication. And we were trying to get him to agree to stay with her for a long time, even when he was in and out of jail in Wyoming and Colorado. And so I talked to him and I said, I'm going to be there in a week to see family. Like, just hang tight, hang with mom, and we'll talk and everything will be fine. And she was, of course, ecstatic because their relationship had been so fragile and just really non-existent, quite frankly. And so she was really happy, I think, about this.
Doing what she could for Sean was exactly what Leda wanted to do. She never wanted him to feel like she wasn't there for him, and she hoped that they could repair their relationship while he was getting back on his feet. And Jessica initially was right there with her mother trying to figure out how they could help Sean. Sean arrived in Renton, Washington on December 10th, and Jessica, who lived out of state, took her family back to Washington to spend Christmas with everyone. Leda told a neighbor she was very excited to have Jessica home for the holidays. With grown kids and grandkids who lived out of state, getting as many people together for Christmas as possible was exciting. But things did not go according to plan at all.
I'd been in touch with my mom, of course, just checking in, and she had never been around him having seizures, and he was having seizures. So to be clear, he does have grand mal seizures. It's very obvious when they happen. He's a big guy. If it happens, you're going to know. So he had a seizure. He had fallen into a glass coffee table at her house. It was a whole event. They called 911. And at that point, I said, well, Mom, we just got to get him into the neurologist. It's probably been a long time since he's had that type of medical care. I said, I can't tell you when. I have no idea. And she agreed. And she said to me the day I flew in, I believe, I need to talk to you about something going on with Sean. I'm worried about him being around Wyatt, which is my eldest son. My eldest son loved my brother, so he was really looking forward to seeing him. But he's almost 13, so at the time closer to 12. So I wanted to talk to her about that. So we actually got back to my stepbrother's house, and she was sitting next to me, and she asked me to come outside with her. And I had this weird feeling of hesitation from her that to me kind of said like something's off, but her guilt of, okay, we haven't had this relationship. I want to rally behind him. I want to support him. But I also have my daughter, and her and I have a good relationship. So we tried to go outside and he would not. He walked out, and it was really weird. I just remember being like, what is that about? So fast forward, she ended up leaving, and I I struggled with that. I'm like, why would she leave? I was frustrated. The plan was, though, she was going to pick him up the next day. So we're all just, sort of relaxing. We had a bonfire going. Everyone was enjoying their time. And I noticed this constant sort of dialect coming from him that was like, I'm bigger, I'm better. Everyone's afraid of me. I go in somewhere and people are afraid of me. It's, it's so weird. And I'm like, okay, this is just bizarre. He's always been a little bit grandiose like that. So I just chalked it up to that's the norm. And anyway, we all went back into the house and he was sort of standing on the back of this couch. And I look, and all of a sudden he slides down the back of the couch. And I said, oh, he's going to have a seizure. And then I expected him to start like having the full grand mal seizure. So I tried to move him to his side. And as he's laying there, he's not, what's the word? Convulsing. He's not doing that. So then I'm kind of like, okay, but he's just kind of doing this odd behavior. He then stands up and he walks in this funny pattern and he goes, meow, meow, and just sort of nonsense. At one point he was dancing and I'm like, okay, this is weird. So at this time, my stepsister-in-law and I kind of reconvene in the other room and I'm like, what is this about? And she's like, I said, could he be having like petit mal seizures? So I then call my mom and she's like, yes, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. He's doing these things and they're really weird. It's like he's there, but he's not. And it's just sort of a bizarre behavior and I can't figure it out. And she goes, I said, well, how long is this happening? And she's like, or how often? Well, 3 to 4 times a day sometimes. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So my stepsister-in-law and I said, I think we should probably take him to the ER. And she's like, I agree. I said, well, let's go out and see if we can kind of get him to go. Because at this point, we realize he's kind of back into the normal state of mind, so to speak. I guess you would call it, he came to. That's what you would normally be if it was a true seizure. So we talk to him. He's agreeable. We go to the hospital. We go through the whole registration process. We get back into the room and I felt like we got lucky. We had a doctor who was willing to do a CAT scan. And also he was wanting to give him some seizure medications, which I felt was really great because sometimes if they stabilize him and send him home, but the fact that he was willing to do the CAT scan to see if there was any activity with the brain tumor would help us piece together a lot of puzzles. Like, okay, is he having seizures because this thing is back? When they were going over the medical history, it just seemed like Sean didn't have a lot of that. There wasn't a lot of medical history. It was just years and years of just nothing. The doctor says, I'm going to give you this medication. It's standard. It's Keppra. And my brother said, well, that medication makes me very angry.
The doctor then asked Sean more questions about the medication and how it made him feel, and especially to what degree did it make him feel these things? Was he feeling an anger that was manageable? Sean said, yes, it was manageable. Sean was then told that they were going to go ahead with the medication because he needed something. He had a seizure a few days before Jessica got to Washington, and then Leda reported he was having seizure-like episodes with those odd behaviors and noise-making multiple times a day. The doctor told him the dosage was going to be low enough that he wasn't really concerned that there would be any major side effects, but it would be a dose that would get him through until he could see a neurologist. So many of you know my podcast origin story. I sent my previously homeschooled kids to public school, got bored very quickly, and Googled how to start a podcast. The parts of the story I tend to leave out are all those moments where doubt crept in. What if I couldn't learn the technology? What if no one listens? How do I even find an audience? Fast forward 10 years and it's clearly the best thing I've ever done, but I know what it's like to start a new business and wonder, is it going to work out? And jumping into something like that is so much easier when you have a partner like Shopify to help you out. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses. You've heard of so many of them like Rare Beauty and Magic Spoon, but they also work with brands that are just getting started. They have hundreds of ready-to-use templates to build a beautiful online store that is matching with your brand style. And Shopify is like having a marketing team behind you to get the word out. You can create emails, social media campaigns, and reach your customers wherever they are. You can tackle all of those important tasks in one place. We're talking inventory, payments, analytics, and everything else. You don't need to save multiple websites. Everything is all in one place, making your life so much easier. And I have to say the biggest doubt I always had was, what if I can't figure it out? With Shopify, they are always around to share advice with their award-winning 24/7 customer service. It is time to turn those what ifs into with Shopify today. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/crimelines. Go to shopify.com/crimelines. That's shopify.com/crimelines. Remember, this is an emergency room. The protocol is to treat the immediate need and then refer out for follow-up care. After the dose of the medication was given to Sean, things shifted.
During this time, I could see my brother, his behavior started to change. At first, it was a lot of, respectful, yes, ma'am, no, sir behavior. So now we're in this waiting game of an ER, and it was also a Friday night in a very busy area. So we knew we were going to be there a while. And I'm engaging in some conversation with him. And I'm just kind of like, what's been going on? Where have you been? You're kind of transient, because I knew at one point he was living in a trailer with no power. So there was questions I had. I'm pulling the big sister role of, what have you been doing? And we've always been close. So it wouldn't be out of the norm for me to act that way towards him. I've always been the protector. I'm a big sister. So he had a rebuttal for everything I asked him. Oh, I wasn't transient. And I'm like, well, kind of homeless, transient, I was trying to use like a nice word to kind of describe the situation without being offensive. His behavior is escalating, and I can see he's getting more tense. And I'm like, I'm feeling uncomfortable. My gut's like, oh, this is weird, And within a few minutes, he starts just saying some very off the wall things. And one of the things that he said was, well, Dad is dying. And I looked at him and I said, well, your dad's not dying. He had a heart attack and stuff, but he's recovering very well and he's doing great. And he said, well, Mom is dying. I said, Mom is also not dying. She does have congestive heart failure, but she's managing it and she's okay. And I said, I joked to him and I said, well, what are you, God? I said, I guess we're all dying. That was my answer. And he looked straight at me and he kind of leaned up over the rail of the bed at the hospital. And he said, I am God. I remember kind of leaning back. I was sitting on one of those round stools that the doctors sort of zoom around in when they're in a room with you. And I pushed myself back up against the wall as far as I could. And I just remember feeling like that was really weird. Then he brings the nurse in to say, basically, he wants to leave. He doesn't want to stay anymore. And she's like, you don't have to, but we do have to have you sign something. And he started talking to her in a very kind of racist, derogatory term because she was of Asian descent. And he said, I know you probably have a black belt. Like, you could hurt me. And she's like, no, I'm not here to hurt you. And then it turns into, I know I can kill everybody in here. And I said, Sean, you cannot say that. That's unsafe. Stop. And he made that comment a few more times. And then I could see the nurse getting really uncomfortable. And by the time that happens, he's elevated. He's saying the Mexican mafia is after him. He's saying he knows that we're going to try to kill him. He knows that we're going to do a sex transplant. He had brought up the doctor being someone that my mom had an affair with, which was bizarre. And I'm like, I don't know what's going on. So at this time, my sister-in-law had already stepped out. The doctors and nurses station were right near us. And so I stand up, and I'm standing at the bottom of the bed. Behind us is a door and a curtain, a sliding door. And he says, close the fucking curtain. And I said, no, I'm not closing the curtain. I said, they'll be right back. And he goes, close the fucking curtain. And I said, Sean, no. And I went to kind of grab his hand and say, everything's okay. We're just trying to get you some help, And he said, don't touch me, and ripped his hand. And I just was looking at him because this is just so unlike what I'm used to seeing him like. And he looked at me and he said, I'm going to fucking kill you. And he came out of the bed after me. I was so blessed that door was open because I flew out of the room. I ran across the room and I remember screaming. And he got hung up by an EKG cord because he had mentioned to them that his heart was feeling weird. So they had hooked him up to that. And I was just like hyperventilating because the way he looked at me, the way he was positioned to attack me in some form was there 100%. And at that time, the nurses and doctors, obviously, they call a code and they start with restraints and sedation. And we went into a waiting room, and I finally had got myself back somewhat composed because I was quite frankly hyperventilating. And the doctors kind of came out and said, there is no need for you to stay. I think that it could elevate the situation. He's going to be having someone watching him nonstop for the next however long, 24 hours or more. He's going to be here a couple of days. We're going to do a mental eval tomorrow and we'll let you know. So that was what happened. We left the hospital.
This outburst and behavior from Sean was something Jessica was not prepared for. It took 5 or 6 guards and hospital workers to restrain him. Jessica knew Sean had seizures and legal issues, and like you heard in that clip, he had been spending the last few years in a transient lifestyle. And because of his criminal history, which included charges for assault, Jessica knew he had outbursts. But she reached out for his hand to comfort him because that would have worked in the past, but this time it only angered him more. It seemed clear to Jessica that Sean was having a mental health crisis. Maybe some of his recent behaviors that Leda thought were seizures were actually mental health related. Jessica was relieved Sean was where he could get evaluated and the professionals could sort out what was going on. But then they held him for less than 24 hours.
Me and my mom had been in communication, through the whole thing. She was very apologetic and, felt so bad for what happened. And she was just very confused, just as much as I was confused. And that next morning, we called for an update on the eval. And by noon, they were releasing him. And I spoke to the evaluator. And she said to me, listen, it was a reaction from the medication. He is not homicidal or suicidal. So we're letting him go. And I said, that's crazy. He is not homicidal or suicidal, but he told me he was going to kill me and came after me and threatened to kill other people.
If you've listened to enough cases like this before, you may already know the limits of a psychiatric hold, but here is Dr. Paige Wilcoxson explaining it. Paige did not and does not have access to Sean's medical file, so this is really just very general information about psych holds.
With a psychiatric hold, you have the issue of someone's rights versus public protection. And, further, I guess, not complicating things, but it's set up. So there has to be a direct link between a mental health or substance use issue and the behavior, right? So just because someone is making threats or maybe even going after you physically doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to meet criteria for an involuntary psychiatric hold. So, if someone is threatening and aggressive and there is no mental health and no substance abuse link, that's a law enforcement issue. So you could also say, why weren't the police called and why wasn't he arrested for that behavior? And maybe they were trying to avoid it by doing the psychiatric hold. But if the person doing the assessment did not see a clear link between an imminent future risk and his current mental health status or, being under the influence of substances, then there is no reason to hold him. So I think it is a little more complicated, and we don't know.
It does seem hard for me to understand that someone can make a direct threat and less than 24 hours be deemed not a risk, but that can fit within the criteria. So I think the discussion here may be, do we need to lower the bar for an involuntary psych hold? And that would then require a discussion on civil liberties that is outside the scope of this episode and frankly this podcast, but it is worth thinking about as individuals and as a collective on where we fall with the balance we have right now. After Sean was released, his response to this very brief hospitalization was to blame Jessica for trying to get him committed, even though she only took him to the hospital to begin with because she thought he was having a seizure. After his threat and his anger towards her, Jessica, understandably, didn't feel comfortable spending the rest of her time in Washington around him, especially considering she had her children with her. But they did have some contact by phone before she left.
I was basically trying to figure out who was picking him up. I was willing to give him a ride to my mom's because where we were was pretty far for her. So my stepbrother and I were going to go. We call him. He answers the phone. Someone had already been on, my mom's friend was already on the way to get him. So I said, what's going on? And he said, oh, I just had like a little breakdown. It happens sometimes. And he had this kind of sinister laugh, like, haha. And I said, that's not normal. I said, what do you mean? And he goes, well, everyone's just always relying on me. And it could be hard sometimes. I don't have anyone to I can't be the one that gets the help. And I'm like, okay. And he goes, but don't worry. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was just trying to scare you. And he laughed. And I said, well, it worked. You scared me half to death, And so, but no, I'll be fine though. And just sort of this elevated behavior that not a big deal, all of that. So fast forward, the next day I get a text from him and it's saying, that he's really sorry and he would never hurt me or the boys, that he would kill himself before he ever did that. And at that time, I just I didn't know what to think. I didn't really have the capacity to respond because I was just trying to process all of this and honestly try to have fun with my family. And the text that was sent to me 2 days after it happened was, I want you to know that I'm truly sorry for what happened. I wish it wasn't like this. I would never do anything to hurt you or the boys. I love you, Jess. I'm going to try my hardest to get this figured out. So, my heartstrings, it kind of tugged at those. And then my mom, her and I were kind of back and forth on some conversations and I was frustrated with her. And then I ignored a text that says, when do you want to meet up so we can give the boys Christmas gifts, which was on Christmas Eve. And then on Christmas morning, I get a text that says, I just want you to know the things that took place and unfolded the other night at the hospital were truly not my fault. And it's wrong to try and hold me accountable for it. I was forced to act the way I did because of the situation I was forced into. I would kill myself before ever hurting you or the boys. And I swear on my daughter that I would. I'm the one who deserves an apology for being forced into a situation that made me have to act like that. Maybe the next time I tell you that I don't need to go to the emergency room and that I shouldn't be given a recommended medicine/substance because it's been known to cause me to get a certain way that most people would be considered dangerous or violent. Maybe motherfuckers might actually listen. So at the time, I just was really surprised. And I said, Merry Christmas. I love you. I feel like responding is only going to cause more issues. I had zero ill intentions taking you to the ER, nor were you forced. Although you may have had a reaction to the medication, there are more issues going on than just the hospital visit. Having my brother tell me he was going to kill me and then coming after me was terrifying. I believe some of what happened is a small part of a way bigger problem. You were talking about how people are afraid of you, move out of your way, and told self-boosting stories the entire night. I wanted to help you, but I can't help someone who sees no issues with actions and who continues with no accountability for the choices they have made. Everything is always everyone else's fault. For a year, I've been sad, scared, and worried about you, the arrests, the things that your friends told me that you were into, and just the overall way you left Oregon. I hope you find peace in your life, Sean, and I hope you start realizing that the stuff that comes out of your mouth is very difficult to believe. I'm sad because I feel like I've lost 3 relatives, you, Mom, and my niece. It's hurtful to have to accept that, but I've always just held on to so much hope that these relationships would be revived and be what I always wished they were. However, I've worked so hard on myself and I'll do anything to protect my peace. Same with the boys. I've had enough chaos in my family and I'm finally in a place where I don't have to have it. I pray for you and I pray you figure it out. So that was, really immediately after the incident.
Though Jessica didn't know it at the time, Sean, as she said, blamed her in private as well, including in his journal.
The journal entry, there were some interesting journal entry sort of topics, so to speak, very like up and down, up and down. Some were quotes that, you probably read online. Some were just based on his feelings, but it makes me wonder a lot. And this has not been anything that like law enforcement has said to me or that they believe to be true. But I wonder if it was part of the premeditation piece, honestly. And obviously I know that this entry would have been sometime between the hospital and him murdering her. And it said, I wish I could go back in time and change what has just happened. I'm having issues accepting what took place at the hospital the other night. Yet I'm also not the one who is to blame for what unfolded while I was there. It wasn't my fault. How do I make my sister realize this? She needs to understand that she is the one who needs to be the person that accepts fault and should be apologizing to me. However, it is I who is to pay the price and be punished for it all. So over the last couple of weeks, I've had to deal with a number of seizures every day for multiple days. I truly believe that me being stressed out, being in physical pain that I am in, and the lack of sleep has been the factors of what is triggering these episodes to occur. What happened while I was at the hospital is not my fault. Why can't my sister understand that she is the one who caused the shit that went down? Why am I being the one that is held accountable and receiving the punishment for it? My heart is broken. I'm truly sorry for the way I reacted to the situation I was placed in. I had no control of myself due to what I was forced to endure. I wish that it could all be taken back, and it can't, and I'm sorry for that. I would kill myself before I would even think about hurting my sister. If her and the doctors would have just listened to me, especially when I told them that was going to happen if they make me take the shit that they gave me. So the reason I acted the way I did is all because they chose to test the waters after being warned what might happen if I was forced to do what they were forcing me to do. I hope they realize all of this now. If my sister wants to act the way she is acting, then fuck her. This is all her fault.
This situation led to an estrangement between Jessica and her mother because Leda took Sean's side. When Jessica left Washington with her kids on December 27th, 2024, she and Leda were not speaking. I talked to Paige about this because this is something I've seen in my own family and those of others around me. And that is a parent overindulging a higher needs child, even an adult child, to the point that it takes away from what they can give to their other children.
Family dynamics, as we all know, can be really, really complicated and really, really difficult. If you're a parent and your child is ill, obviously we all want to, help protect and care for that child. And the parent thinking, obviously this child needs more support and more care than someone who may not be struggling with mental health or substance abuse issues. So I think understanding that it is coming from a place of care, even if to the other sibling or other people in the family, it just may seem just really biased and unfair. I think also, a parent wanting to, try to help the child, just in a way that they know how. So they may not have the skills to deal with mental health issues, but they're just trying to, be what they see as a good parent by offering that child more support, be it emotionally, financially, with housing and resources. But, it does obviously have an impact on family dynamics, and it probably isn't always the healthiest thing to do from a family dynamics perspective. If you're able to, I would really involve a professional, for either you individually as a parent to get some extra support yourself, because obviously it is very stressful having a child who's struggling, well, with any issue, but with, mental health and substance abuse issues. And that, I think, having professional support can help you learn better boundaries and can maybe help you see your behavior. I think the intent is usually good, protecting and supporting the child who's struggling, but it may not be having a good impact on the child that is struggling and their siblings and other family members. So just looking at, how your actions in wanting to help can maybe impair those family dynamics even more, and how to set some better boundaries, and also just acknowledging the frustration and hurt that the other siblings and family members may be experiencing.
Because Jessica wasn't in contact with her mom after Christmas of 2024, we don't know much about the last month of her life. Even neighbors who usually saw Leda and chatted with her from time to time reported not really seeing her much. But based on the neighbors' reports, we do know Leda started a new job at the airport that she was excited about, and we also know she was disappointed about the estrangement with Jessica. And we know that Sean continued to come and go from the apartment as he still lived there full time. And then, shortly after midnight on January 21st, 2025, we know Leda called a neighbor but hung up. He called her back and she said, it was just a butt dial and she hadn't meant to call him. The call lasted for maybe 5 seconds and the neighbor said she seemed fine. But then, 2 hours later at 2:08 a.m., Sean Lowe called 911. Sean didn't, right off the bat, say what was wrong with Leda. He had to be pushed for that information. But in short, he told the dispatcher that he had a seizure, and when he woke up from it, he found his mother, 62-year-old Leda Files, on the floor and not breathing. Sean had some trouble giving the dispatch the exact address because he said he wasn't from there and he was only there because his mother had been dying and he was helping her. He told the dispatcher that Leda had been sick with chronic heart failure and her death was imminent. Sean also told the dispatcher that he tried to call the cremation services to come pick up Leda's body, but the number didn't work. He said that maybe, quote, they got into his phone and changed his information while he was having that seizure. Did not identify who they were. The dispatcher did try to get Sean to attempt CPR, but he said it wouldn't help. According to what is in the police reports, Sean was calm during this call, and he was still calm when the Renton police initially arrived at the apartment. The first officers on the scene found Sean sitting on a couch outside of the apartment in a communal area. He had a few things around him, a phone, some vapes, a lighter, and keys. He told them that he was waiting for the Washington State Patrol to arrive, and one of the officers noticed that Sean was scrolling on the WSP website on his phone. One officer waited with Sean while the other went into the apartment. Everything was neat and tidy aside from little things like a broken cigarette on the living room floor. Near a chair in the living room was a notepad with the word cremated written on it, but nothing was really out of place until the officer got to the bedroom. Given how neat everything else was, it was noticeable that things were out of place here, and it looked like there had been a struggle. Leda was found lying on her stomach on the floor between the wall and the bed, and she was wearing a tank top and pajama bottoms. The officer checked for vitals and found that though Leda was still warm, she had no pulse. He requested the fire department to send emergency medical services to the scene, and he pushed the bed out of the way so that they could get to Leda. EMS arrived and rolled Leda to her side. They knew, at that point, it was too late. Lividity, which is the pooling of blood after death, had already started in her chest area. But what they noticed besides that changed everything in this presumed death call. Leda did not die from chronic heart failure. She had blood on her nose and in her mouth, and she had bruising on her neck, signs of a physical attack. The officer went out into the hallway where Sean was still calmly sitting and patiently waiting, and told him he was being detained. Out came the handcuffs, and that was the end of the calmness. Sean Lowe is a big guy, over 6 feet tall, and he was not going to make this easy on them. It took multiple people to get him to the ground, and even then he kept pulling his arms under his body so they couldn't cuff him. Eventually, they got him cuffed and in a seated position. They then Mirandized him, but at the end, when they asked if he understood the rights as they were read to him, Sean refused to answer, so they didn't ask him any questions. Sean said he needed to go outside because he was about to have a seizure, so they decided to take him to sit in a patrol car. Sean stood up and started to walk, but when they got to the steps, he let his legs go out from under him and he started resisting again. A neighbor came out and tried to help by telling Sean to calm down and to stop fighting, but he didn't listen. The police had to use a hobble to secure his feet and then roll him onto a mega mover, which is basically a big tarp that they use to move people when they can't get a stretcher in. They rolled Sean onto the mover so they could safely carry him down the steps, but even then he was trying to stand up out of it. They finally got Sean to the patrol car, but he declined medical assistance in spite of insisting that he was about to have a seizure. He did not, as far as I can tell through the files that have been released so far to Jessica, have a seizure in those hours after his arrest. Sean was taken to the station where he was acting, quote, agitated and erratic, but he was aware to some degree of what was going on, because when they read him his Miranda rights again, he said he wanted an attorney. And at another point, he overheard them talking about contacting his sister, Jessica, to inform her of their mother's death, and he quickly asked them not to call her. So while Sean was noted to be speaking rapidly, tripping over sentences, and not really engaging with the officers for some of the time, he was clear enough to get his point across when it mattered to him, like not having Jessica contacted and invoking his right to speak with an attorney. Sean was, later that morning, transported to the hospital so they could take blood samples and DNA swabs. While there, Sean seemed more willing to talk. I mean, he was still saying he didn't want to talk, but then he kept talking. It was around 7:40 in the morning, more than 5 hours after he called 911, and he told an officer he wanted to get the death penalty and he was submitting to law enforcement. He asked what questions they had for him, and the response was, nothing right now. And he said, ask me a question. When he got no response to that, Sean said, quote, I killed my mother. Given that Sean had already asked for an attorney, and he was strapped to a gurney at the time, an investigator read him his rights again. After hearing his rights read to him, Sean said, do you want me to speak with you guys? And he was told they would be happy to hear whatever he had to say. This time, the story changed. Sean admitted he killed Leda, but said it was in self-defense. He said Leda was sitting up in her bed and she reached for a gun that was near her, leaning up against the wall, so he pushed her down and got on top of her. He said he kept his knee on her chest and neck until she stopped moving. Sean was then asked, quote, then you held her there until she stopped moving and you assumed she was dead at that point? And Sean replied, quote, well, I was hoping so. I mean, I was literally waiting and waiting and waiting and then called you guys, end quote. He said it took 15 to 20 minutes. After Leda was dead, he said he moved her body to the floor because he was looking for his phone. So Sean claimed that Leda reached for the gun, but he made other statements that sounded like maybe this was about something else. He accused Leda of hurting him by giving him drugs. He said she needed to die because she was an effing bitch. And he said she had congestive heart failure and was supposed to be dying. And then Sean made another comment that caught the investigators' attention. He referenced that there was a video on his phone. The police got a warrant to compel Sean to biometrically open his phone, and after he unlocked the phone, he offered to show them where this video was. They told him it was up to him if he wanted to show them, and he said that he did because his mother tried to kill him. So he went to the gallery and pulled up the video. The investigators noted that it said today in the gallery, so they knew that this video was taken in the early hours before he called 911. The video was around 15 minutes long. Sean was holding the phone as he recorded Leda while they had a verbal argument. Leda was obviously upset as she sat up in bed, and Sean would not leave the room in spite of her telling him to repeatedly. I have not seen the video, but it is outlined and described in the probable cause affidavit, which is where I am pulling this from. Sean can be heard telling Leda that he knows when she is going to die and that it is imminent. He said Leda was hiding something, and she said she didn't have to prove anything to him, but mostly Leda was just asking him to leave her alone, saying that she didn't want to talk to him, saying that she wasn't going to be held hostage in her own home. If Sean didn't want to leave, she would leave. I mean, if there was a way to tell someone to go away, Leda tried it. She even asked Sean why he wouldn't go, and he said, "So I can say goodbye to you." And then, in echoes of what Sean said to Jessica in the hospital, he proclaimed he was God. He said no one could touch him and that Leda was going to hell. Leda told him she was asking him nicely to leave her alone, and his response was that she should feel badly for him because he had a mother like her. She told him her heart had always been with him, and he said, no, it hasn't. He asked Leda if she wanted to go to hell and then said, "Give yourself to me, Mom." And she told him he wasn't Christ. The affidavit said that there was a lot more movement of the phone at this point, reflecting that Sean was getting more agitated. Sean said Leda was afraid of him, and she admitted, yes, she was. He was being, in her words, psycho, and that's why she was afraid. Sean told the police that Leda reached for the gun and implied that is what the video would show, but that is not described as being in the video. It was noted that there was no physical confrontation between the two of them at all that was recorded. It was Leda in her bedroom, in her bed, in her pajamas, and Sean refusing to leave and obviously scaring her. At some point after this video was made, there was a call from that phone that recorded the video to the Washington Cremation Centers at 1:53 a.m. Sean told the 911 dispatcher that the call didn't work, but it actually did, and it was recorded. Sean called to report that his mother had died and he needed her to be picked up from their home. He said he filled out the application on the website already. But before Sean could give them the information they needed, he said he had to find a phone charger, but the call disconnected shortly after that. In the written description of this phone call, it says Sean sounded confused at the end of it. It was then, 15 minutes later, that Sean called 911. And in between those two phone calls, a neighbor heard something. She told the police she was a light sleeper, and she woke up to a thud followed by repetitive thumping. The noise stopped, but it was enough that she decided to go check on her kids to make sure they hadn't fallen out of bed. She had an indoor security camera, so when the police checked the footage, they could see her walking through the living room and going to check on her daughter at 2:01 a.m. So Sean called the cremation center at 1:53. There was a thud and knocking sounds at 2, and then 911 was called at 2:08. At first I wondered, did this mean Sean called the cremation center before killing Leda, which would explain the 2 a.m. sounds? We know Leda fought back. 2 of her acrylic nails had been lost in the struggle, and Sean had scratches on him. But then I thought, was it possible that after Sean killed Leda and made that call to the cremation center, he did have a seizure, leading to the thumping noise, and then he called 911 when he came to? By noon on the day of Leda's murder, the police had most of the evidence in this case, minus the autopsy report, and they were at the station trying to get in touch with Leda's family to give them the terrible news. They managed to get the name of the mother of Sean's child because she had previously taken out a protective order on him. But when they reached out to her, she couldn't help because she had been out of touch with Sean's family for a while at that point. But someone else got word to the family because Sean's dad called the police to see what was going on before they called him. The police report even said an officer pulled Sean's jailhouse phone records to see if he called anyone, but he didn't. The person who got in touch with the family about Sean's arrest was actually probably a scammer.
Initially, I was homesick and I'd taken the day off. I got a call from his dad and I answered because it's very unusual. He doesn't call me a ton. And he said, "Do you know about your brother being in jail? Have you talked to your mom?" And I said, "No, we had not spoken." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, we got a phone call from another family member that someone was supposed to post his bail because he's in jail for a homicide investigation." I suspect at that time that must have been a spam call or something that scammers trying to get money. So she alerted him. And then I said, "Well, that's crazy. Maybe that's something to do with why we all had this theory that he kind of acted like he was running from something in Wyoming." So he said, "Well, maybe it had to do with something in Wyoming." And I agreed. So I called the jail myself and they have an automated system. So I was able to confirm that he was in jail in custody for a homicide investigation. So I said, "Okay, I'll try to call my mom." I called, I got a voicemail. I called, I got a voicemail. I texted, nothing. And then at that time, his dad was looking on the computer and there was an initial article that I don't even really remember at this time, but something along the lines of the same city and state my mom lived in, 62-year-old woman found dead in her apartment, son is suspect, something like that.
The following day, an autopsy found that Leda had suffered from a broken hyoid bone, broken ribs, and a broken sternum. All injuries consistent with how Sean said he killed her. 34-year-old Sean Lowe was initially charged with second-degree murder, but the evidence, including that video, led to the charge being upgraded to first-degree murder. As it stands at the time of this recording, that charge is still pending. Normally, I don't cover cases pending trial, but this one was a little different. There is no question on who did this, and Sean's culpability will be determined by experts on both sides of the courtroom. I spoke with Paige, who previously worked as a forensic psychologist, about what this process is like in general when it comes to evaluating someone who has committed a crime and there may be mental health factors at play.
Having someone in a period where they can be clinically observed for a long period of time, a few days, is very, very useful because it's, not too difficult to, say you were malingering and you're trying to make someone believe that you're ill, but you're not really ill. You're just pretending to, be found NGRI or to get to a hospital or something like that. It's not that difficult to pretend that for maybe, a few hours during an interview. It's a lot harder to be consistent in presenting that way across several days when you're like on a psychiatric unit and just people are observing you and watching how you interact interpersonally with other people on the ward. So, when I was practicing, I would always look at all the notes that the nursing staff had taken just to see how someone was behaving and look for consistency, across time and across interacting with different people. There's also, a bunch of different clinical tests that you can give. There's personality tests that can determine to a reasonable degree of certainty if someone is what you would call faking bad, which means they're just trying to appear perhaps more ill or more symptomatic than they may be, or even faking good, which is they're trying to appear healthier than they may be. And then there's some assessments that you can just use for malingering to try to tease out if maybe they're faking. And when I say faking, I don't mean that they're not mentally ill at all. You could also be very ill, but trying to make it seem worse to get, some sort of secondary gain or to, get out of charges or to be found NGRI. It doesn't mean you're not ill. It just means that you are exaggerating your illness for secondary gain.
There is little doubt in my mind that Sean's attorney is going to try to parse out what contributed to Sean's actions. If you're wondering about the medication that Sean blamed the outburst at the hospital on, he was not taking it. Jessica said that when she went to clean out the apartment, she found different seizure medications. But his drug use, mental health, and trauma from brain surgery may have all been factors. The question is, to what degree?
There is a lot of parallels where this does mimic a mental health problem, but also if you look back at the behavior that he exhibits and sort of the tendencies that he had as a human, that narcissistic need for control, violence, constant excuses and manipulation, you can't get a story from him where it's A to B. It's A to F to G to Z to you're bouncing all over sort of like a ping pong ball. And also someone who's manipulative to his capacity, really good at gaining empathy for him. And it's alarming because you kind of go, well, I don't know. He can be so likable and charming and charismatic and this person that I like. I mean, even as his sister, admittedly so, I adored him.
Jessica said that Sean's behaviors of threats and violence go way back before he moved in with Leda. While she never thought it would escalate to the point that he killed anyone, looking back, she can still see there was an escalation.
His behavior over this long course of time for this sort of power, control, violence has escalated. He has a daughter that he is no longer allowed to see, and it's been like that for a long time. There was a protective order put in place until she's 18. I don't know the details of that, but I imagine as a mother, for me to make that decision, I would have to feel very threatened. And I know that threats for him were common. I remember a particular time where he had joked with her and said to me that he was joking, like, if she was going to have an abortion, I was going to tie her to the bed and then I would kill her afterwards after she had our daughter. You don't joke about those types of things. I know that he has told a couple of his friends that I've talked to that if he ever caught a body, he would say he had a seizure. The last girl that he dated in Wyoming described his behavior when he left as just very bizarre. And she confided in me some of those stories. So I think that it is honestly a personality disorder. I suspect something like cluster B, the narcissistic tendencies that he has is very well there. He has a lot of control. And I do think that obviously drugs and some of maybe his medical conditions have played a part in whatever neurological makeup is going on in his brain as well. I mean, I don't see how it wouldn't. I know that when he had the tumor removed, the doctor was very adamant about, please follow this plan medically, no smoking weed. And the type of drugs he used over the years just sort of escalated and escalated. And at some point, I can't imagine that would be conducive to a healing environment of a brain tumor, as it's not conducive to just normal day-to-day living, right? So for me, I do believe it's both. People ask me all the time, is he mentally ill? I mean, obviously someone that has murdered someone is mentally ill, but there is a level of control that he absolutely displays in these situations, in his confessions. Even how he confessed to the police officers was all dependent on him having control of the situation.
I asked Paige about risk assessment because maybe you've been listening to this all along and you don't know how no one saw this coming.
I think people from the outside, or maybe they're like watching TV or even listening to some podcasts, they can get the impression that, behavior is really clear and, when there's warning signs and we can predict risk and we can know what's going to happen, when really it's really, really difficult to predict. Even if someone is making threats or, may appear to want to harm someone, whether they're actually going to follow through on it is just super difficult to predict, especially on an individual level. And then when you sort of factor in other, mental health issues and substance use and family dynamics, I think it's easy to think about it as, is this a system that failed and could this have been prevented? Or did we just not have all the information? What more could have been, I guess, discovered? And I think it's also really easy to think about, well, people should be detained, or, the public needs to be protected. But it's a really, really difficult balance between that and also looking at the person who may be struggling with mental health and substance abuse issues and looking at their own sort of rights for autonomy. It's, I think the mental health system, it's often in such a difficult place because you're really trying to balance protecting the public and protecting the rights of the individual.
For Jessica, the grief of this situation has been difficult, but so has the isolation. Cases seem so cut and dry sometimes. The person was in their right mind and chose to commit a violent act, or they weren't and they didn't know what they were doing, or they didn't know it was wrong. I think of the case I covered of Stephen Douglas, the Australian social worker, who was killed by his client who was in a state of psychosis. This isn't like that at all. It is a gray area, and that can be a lonely area.
And honestly, I just want to spread more awareness that this is a very unusual circumstance, but there isn't a lot of support for victims of this type of loss. It's complicated. It's one of those things can be true at the same time sort of scenarios, and it's tough. I grieve my mom. Obviously, just losing someone in this capacity is really hard. It's really, really awful. But then I also grieve the loss of this idea of my brother, who I thought he was as a human, as my brother, as a dad, as an uncle, a son, all of those things. And it's really, really, really complicated.
Jessica has found support where she can with other families who have experienced a loss and those who have experienced loss through homicide. And one thing she has found that really helped her was getting the files from the police. Some people don't want to know any details, and while Jessica doesn't want graphic details more than she's already been exposed to, she also doesn't want surprises if this does go to trial, and she has to sit in that courtroom. She doesn't want to hear it for the first time in front of everyone else. Jessica plans to attend the trial, if there is one, and continue to heal from this tragedy. As she processes everything that happened and everything that led to it, Paige has some parting words.
It's so hard, and certainly, when I used to do treatment with especially patients who are mandated to be there, so they don't necessarily want treatment. They're just involved with the criminal justice system, and they've been basically coerced into this sort of treatment. It's so hard, but you can only do so much. If the person doesn't want to change their behavior, if they don't, necessarily think they've done something wrong or have that motivation, that internal motivation to change, nothing that a clinician can do or a family member or a loved one can do is really going to change that. And I think it's really hard, but you have to really come to that understanding. And it's also really important to not blame yourself if the person didn't accept your advice or listen to you, because you can do everything right and it can still end up in a situation that has an outcome that no one wanted.
As this case progresses through the legal system, I will be sure to update you. If you or someone you know are experiencing substance use disorder or mental health issues and you are in the United States, you can call the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration National Helpline at 1-800-662-4357, or you can text your zip code to 435748 to get a referral to local treatment facilities, support groups, and community-based organizations. It is time for May Patreon birthday shoutouts. I love doing these because it gives me a minute to just pause and say how much I appreciate your support as I continue to podcast and build beyond the files and getting Crimelines where I want it to be. This support is why I can do this job. So I want to say a very happy birthday to Michelle, Jacob, Amelia, and Katie. I hope your birthday is filled with good food, good people, and an excuse to treat yourself a little bit extra. Thank you so much for being here. And from me to you, I want to say happy birthday.